All right. Good morning, everyone. For those of you in your mornings and some of you looking at the list of attendees, really early morning for you. Good afternoon to those of you after lunch, and appreciate everybody taking time out of their evenings to join us if you're in an evening time zone. So thanks for joining our webinar today on PCI DSS 4.0 and its applicability to NonStop. Now, what this presentation will go through is give you a little bit of a primer of what PCI DSS 4.0 is and what some of the highlights are in terms of differences between the previous standards and the new one and how they apply to NonStop. Now, we're not going to cover every single requirement. We're just going to hit the highlights and give you some tools and knowledge of how you could address those for NonStop. But then we've got a more comprehensive analysis, which I'll talk about towards the end of the presentation. I'm Steve Tcherchian, Chief Product Officer at XYPRO Technology, and thank you for taking time out of your day and spending 45 minutes with us to talk about something that's critical in just about every environment, and that's PCI DSS 4.0. Most of you are already familiar with XYPRO, but a little bit of some of the recent happenings with XYPRO. We're headquartered in sunny, at least this week, sunny Southern California, Simi Valley, actually. And we've had a nice break from the month-long rain we've had here. Our expertise, our focus is primarily on HPE NonStop security, cybersecurity, but we've recently added some new products into our portfolio, mainly around SAP HANA and Linux, and that's Red Hat and SUSE security and monitoring. So if there's interest in that, please follow up with us after this webinar. We're globally based, support sales and services. We've had a very strong partnership with HPE, and some of you are already familiar with this. We have the only SailPoint and CyberArk integration, certified integration for NonStop. Our focus at XYPRO is around integration, modernization, and innovation of the platform and your mission critical workloads. So a lot of our technologies, a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today will fit in one of those key three key tenets. Like I said, strategic partnerships with recently SAP, CyberArk, SailPoint, ServiceNow, HPE, and recently Red Hat and SUSE. We've got over 700 customers worldwide. We've got a global 24/7 operation. And an interesting statistics actually is our staff can speak over 24 different languages. So if you're more comfortable communicating in a language other than English with us, we've probably got somebody on our staff that can help you out. Okay, jumping into the meat of it. So this is the current state of cybersecurity. I won't go through every single one of these statistics, but it's 2023, and these numbers are only increasing. There's been a lot of emphasis, especially over the last year or two, on ransomware. And in 2021, ransomware is costing the world economy over $20 billion. And that number has significantly grown since this statistic came out. This is the top level discussion at almost every customer I interact with is ransomware. We've said for years that ransomware on NonStop, because of its inherent architecture, is safe and secure and not really an issue, or at least viruses are not really an issue. Ransomware changes the game when it comes to new threats, because all you've got to do is encrypt a file, throw away a key, and there's your ransom. There's how you can hold something at ransom. And it's not from the outside that you need to worry about things like this. It's from the inside. It's the person that has access to do things like this, has access to the tools and the data and the knowledge primarily to be able to execute something like this on mass scale. Now, 80% of organizations rank cybersecurity as a top 5 concern for them, and it's not getting any easier. The scary part about all these numbers is all the tools, the technology, and the understanding already exist to address these concerns. The problem is best practices are not being followed, and I'll talk about why in a few slides. More scary statistics. Numbers just keep increasing. Again, ransomware changes the game. For years, for decades, we've said viruses, malware, those types of malicious activity on NonStop are not really a strong concern because of the architecture of the platform and the operating system, but it doesn't matter anymore. Ransomware is getting so much publicity globally, up and down every single organization, that if I'm a CIO, if I'm a CTO, if I'm on the board, all I care about are all of my assets, is all of my customer data properly protected against ransomware. We don't want to talk about the bits and bytes when it comes to the C-level and the board. We want to say, yes, we are protected against ransomware, and we can recover very quickly if something were to happen. Governments are also paying attention. There's a lot of government regulation there around compliance. HIPAA's been out there for a while in the healthcare industry. We're going to be focusing this conversation on PCI DSS. But if you're in NERC CIP is out there, if you're in government and defense, DFARS is out there, GDPR for the European Union. And recently, President Biden signed U.S. Executive Order 14028. That now requires government agencies and companies interacting with government agencies to follow a strict guideline of cybersecurity practices. Okay, jumping into PCI DSS 4.0. PCI DSS, PCI itself stands for Payment Cards Industry Data Security Standard. This has been a standard that's been around since, I think, 2005. This year, PCI DSS 4.0 was released. This is the 10th iteration of the standards, and it's been 4 years in the making since the last version, PCI 3.2.1. Now, the last standard was 139 pages. This standard has increased to 360 pages. It's the most thorough, most comprehensive standard that PCI has put out to date. This current standard required 3 rounds of requests for comments and over 6,000 comments to land on 360 pages. And I'll say I'm guilty. I may have been a contributor to some of those comments, so apologies, but it's all for good. It's all for good reason. Now, the big changes to PCI 4.0 is it's not a point in time activity. Compliance has always been an activity that's looking backwards. It's applying lessons learned to make sure that things that have happened in the past don't happen again in the future, but it's always a backward looking activity. Now, PCI tried to change that with the advent of 4.0. So what they're trying to do is really encourage thinking of security as an ongoing practice, not a point in time activity where you generate a certain activity or evidence, can put a check mark in a box and get the auditor off your back. It's no longer the case. It's got to be real time. It's got to be continuously monitored, and you've got to ensure that everything you've put into place will continue that same way going into the future. PCI 4.0 also introduced the concept of a customized approach. Now, if you're in the compliance business, you know PCI is probably the most prescriptive standard out there. Even if you're not in the payments card industry, PCI 4.0 and all of the requirements that they'll lay out there and the way they prescribe of how you comply with them is very thorough. There's no gray area. It's black and white. Do this or you're not compliant. Now, when it comes to security best practices, that should be your baseline of everything that should be applied. I always say, if you're not in even if you're not in the payments card industry, take a look at the PCI standard and apply everything on there that you can to at least establish your security baseline and then grow from there. The challenge has been with PCI is because they're so prescriptive, if you didn't match exactly what the standard said you needed to do to comply with the requirement, you were not compliant. Now, there was an idea of compensating controls or other ways to address requirements, but the ultimate goal is meet the requirement based on the standard. With the inception of the customized approach, now those companies that have mature security practices that might not address exactly what the requirement says, but can fulfill the objective using different controls, can still be compliant with the standard. And we'll talk about some examples of that. So the objective of PCI 4 was designed with a zero trust understanding strategy in mind. This is to ensure that the standard continues to meet the security needs of the payments industry. So we know we hear the buzzword zero trust, zero trust, zero trust. And I'm often asked, what does it mean? And every time somebody answers it, you get a different response. And then there's all kinds of understandings of what it is. Zero trust is really don't trust anything on your network, on your systems, even your employees, which means validating everything at every level. Now, that might seem like overkill, but once you start peeling away the layers of the onion and understand what it really gains you, it'll start making a lot more sense. Whereas previously, our approach was, okay, verify at the network level or the VPN, for example. And once you're on the VPN, that user has access to everything that they're entitled to. But this doesn't account for if that account was compromised. Yes, the user ID itself has access, but how can you establish that that user using that user ID is who's supposed to be using it? That's where zero trust comes into play, is they'll authenticate to the VPN, but then every asset, every data that they're trying to get access to is verified and interrogated, and only when it's confirmed that that user is who's supposed to be accessing that data or that asset, that's how they're granted access. And PCI was very aware of this strategy going forward. So a lot of the requirements focus on applying zero trust strategies to them. Okay, speaking of the customized approach, if you've looked at the PCI 4.0 standard, you're going to see the exact requirement and how they require you to meet that requirement. What are the controls you need to put in place? But also, you're going to have now additional language around customized approach and what other methodologies can be used to address that requirement. So again, if you've got something, if you don't have the exact control that's defined in the standard, but you can address the objective of the standard and still with other tools or other methodologies that you've got in place, you can still be compliant with that requirement. So this isn't present for all requirements, but a lot of them will have a defined approach and a customized approach. So it's focusing on the objective. Now, when I talk about focusing on the objective, it's not just meeting the requirement. PCI 4.0 also emphasizes the quality of evidence. So not only do you have to meet the requirement, but you have to prove with quality of the evidence you're providing that, yes, what you're doing will address that requirement. So a lot of emphasis on quality of evidence. So PCI 4.0 introduced 64 new requirements. 13 of those are effective immediately if you want to comply with PCI 4.0 right now. Now, PCI 4 doesn't come into play, isn't a requirement until March of 2024. We'll talk about what that means. So some requirements are become mandatory in 2024. The rest are best practices until 2025. Once March 2025 comes along, PCI 4.0 and all of its requirements must be met. So 13 of them are best practices until 2024, unless you want to assess against 4.0 right now. Otherwise, in 2024, those 13 best practices become requirements. The other 51 are best practices until 2025, where they become requirements. The biggest impacts to 4.0 are in requirements 8, 10, 11, and 12. So what I often say is we're in 2023 right now. PCI 3.2.1 is still valid. You can still assess against that requirement and still be compliant. So what I often advise is use the next year to understand what the requirement is and how to map it to controls within your organization, and use this next year to become PCI 4 ready. You don't have to be compliant with PCI 4, but you've only got a year now to become ready, where those 13 requirements kick in. In March 2024, 3.2.1 will officially be retired, and all assessments must be done against PCI 4. This is the same old list that we've been hearing about for a very, very long time when it comes to compliance. It's why can we not become compliant? Why are those statistics that I showed at the front of this presentation still an issue in 2023? The tools are there, the technology is there, the understanding is there, the requirements are there, but we're still getting hit with massive ransomware, massive hacks that are being publicized all over the place, and it's not slowing down, and it's costing companies a fortune to deal with it. Well, some of the challenges is our inadequate leadership, especially when it comes to cybersecurity. If you have to advocate from the bottom up, meaning from your role up to your management, your leadership, and your board, it's a futile effort. This has to, security and compliance needs to be from the top down, because if the support is there at the most senior levels of the organization to stay secure, to stay compliant, to mitigate risk, that messaging will flow down, and it will be much easier to get funding to be able to do the activities that need to happen to make sure that you're compliant. Even with all that, lack of resources and capabilities are always a challenge. There's a huge gap right now in the cybersecurity industry, and that gap is only increasing. Now, there might be a little bit of relief with all the layoffs happening all over the place, but for the longest time, just finding good qualified resources to be able to handle this kind of stuff has always been a challenge. And it's execution. A lot of this stuff can be overwhelming. You look at a 350 plus page standard, where do you even begin? You start reading the first 2 pages, and if you don't fall asleep, your head's going to be spinning after 10 or 15 pages. But you've got to stick with it. You've got to be able to execute on the objective. Going back to leadership, it's communication and culture. If the culture is not built around cybersecurity as a focus for everybody, not just for the IT folks, but this is for everybody, you're going to have a struggle trying to become secure properly. It's manual. For those of you that have to provide evidence, that are in compliance, that have to do all of this activity, you know how tedious that can be, going through reports and having to sort and format and correlate and do all this stuff. It's a very, very manual, challenging activity. Fortunately, the tools and technology are out there. We've advanced enough where machine learning, AI, and other automation tools exist to make our lives much, much, much easier. Okay, so how do we begin? We're talking about a 350 plus page standard that increased by over 200 pages in just the last few years. How do you go through and understand what to apply and where you need to focus your energy on? Well, like I said, we've got a year right now between now and March 2024 to really interpret, translate, and evaluate how the standard will apply to your organization. So start with that. Now, I'm not saying you need to read every line of the entire standard. We've done a lot of the XYPRO has done a lot of that work for you, and we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. But really, use the next year to understand how the standard is going to apply to your organization first. That way, you're not trying to boil the ocean. And then map those to things that are applicable to you and what controls you currently have in place. Now you've got an understanding of what are the things you think you need to tackle. Second thing you need to do is get a baseline of where you are. Do a gap assessment. XYPRO can help you. There's tools out there that can help you, but get an understanding of where you currently stand to know where else you need to grow into to become compliant. Only then do you start implementing controls. Otherwise, you're putting the cart before the horse. So read the requirement, map it to what you have, translate it to what it means to your organization, and do a gap assessment to understand where your deficiencies are. Then you know which controls you need to implement. Once you've done that, then you can do a proper assessment. You can do a practice assessment and understand if you're going to be compliant with PCI 4.0. I'm sure there's going to be gaps after you reach that 4th box, which is then you can repeat this whole process, but then the footprint that you're going to need to address is going to become much smaller. Okay, let's jump into specific requirements. Again, I'm only hitting the highlights here. We'll talk about this a little more comprehensively at the end of the presentation. But requirement 3, this is one that we hear at XYPRO hear about quite often, and it's around protecting stored account data, your PANs, your sensitive authentication data, and other primary account information or personal information. So 4.0 clarified those requirements around sensitive authentication data and PAN numbers. Now there's requirements that focus on data retention and disposal. There's new requirements about encryption when it comes to storing data electronically before authorizations are complete, and new requirements for issuers of how they're encrypting keys and using cryptography. Now, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the differences between 3.21 and 4.0, it's going to have a more comprehensive list. And then we've got a document we've written at XYPRO that tells you how those apply to NonStop. But I just wanted to call these out as focus areas to know that there are changes in requirement 3 around how PANs and sensitive authentication data are stored. All right, multi-factor authentication is another area that has seen some advancement in PCI 4. Now, in the NonStop world, Zygate user authentication comes on your operating system, and that'll give you all of your multi-factor authentication capabilities. But in PCI 4 now, to be compliant with the MFA requirements, both requirements 8.4.2 and 8.4.3 must be met. So what that means is MFA at the VPN is no longer good enough. You've got, even if you MFA at your VPN, you've got to MFA a second time before that user can enter the CDE, the card data environment. So MFA is required for all access into the CDE, regardless of your MFAing everywhere else. This is one of those staples that I talked about earlier where best practices are not being done. MFA is a no-brainer in your organization, in your personal life. This has got to be turned on everywhere. It's really the most secure method we have right now to protect against somebody guessing your password or using a password list to access an account. If you don't have MFA turned on in your personal life for everything that's it's available for, please, after this presentation, just go through all your apps on your phone, anywhere that has MFA, turn it on. But for your organization, if you don't have MFA turned on, that can be a very dangerous and risky process that you've got in your organization. Turn on MFA, you've got the tools already. This will help you become compliant with a lot of requirements in PCI 4. Okay, not really applicable to NonStop, but I do want to talk about it, is wireless access now also applies. Even if you don't have wireless in your environment, PCI 4.0 has requirements that make you focus on wireless access. So ensuring that defaults are confirmed and secure and changed. Physical access to wireless access points are restricted. Even if you don't have wireless in your environment, you've got to go through these requirements and see how you're going to comply with them. So I've highlighted the ones that need attention. These are the ones that are new to PCI 4. Excuse me. So take a look at these, take a look at the document I'm going to show at the end of this presentation, and make sure you've got at least the processes and the documentation and the evidence to be able to comply with these requirements. Okay, some new requirements around SSL and early TLS. So this has been a challenge in PCI 3 as well, because there are legacy applications out there, and tons of them, especially in the NonStop world, that just can't comply with the modern SSL technology that's out there. These applications were written decades ago and just don't have the capabilities to introduce new types of libraries that can do modern SSL and TLS encryption. So PCI has taken that into account and has written some requirements around that. If you look at 2.2.5, 2.2.7, 4.21, they're going to talk about if you're using SSL or early TLS, TLS 1.0, TLS 1.1, even TLS 1.2. They're going to tell you what you need to do to be able to be PCI 4 compliant. Okay, there's focus on bespoke and custom software. So PCI DSS, the payments application data security standard, that's going away. So PCI 4.0 has introduced some language around bespoke and custom software, and what are the things you need to do to comply with 4.0. So I've highlighted these here. I'm happy to share. We'll share this presentation out afterwards. You can actually read about it and see how those will apply to your organization. Okay, Now, noteworthy changes to NonStop. Requirements 5231. Using targeted risk analysis to define the frequency of periodic evaluations of systems not at risk of malware. This means you're NonStop. So making sure that you've got the tools in place that you can do a proper risk analysis to define what is the period that you need to evaluate the NonStop for malware. Using risk analysis to define malware scans. So this is becoming more and more of a requirement, is staying proactive on scanning your system to ensure that nobody has introduced anything in your environment that shouldn't be there. So the tools in the past that would just certify on a monthly or quarterly basis that you're no longer, that these things don't apply or you don't have malware on your system, you can see now the language is migrating towards more real time. So the tools we had in place before that can do these types of evaluations on a periodic basis may no longer be sustainable to do these more frequent, more real-time monitoring that PCI 4 requires. We'll talk about Zygate Security 1 in a few slides and how that can help address some of these requirements. I see a couple of questions. I'll pick those up at the end. These are good questions coming through. Okay, some additional requirements that'll be applicable to NonStop. 834, lockout user for 30 minutes after 10 password failed attempts. Now, this was previously 6. This was increased, and I want to say they made it less secure because previously after 6 failed attempts, you would lock out the user. Now it's 10 failed attempts. But remember, MFA is a requirement. You've got to have both of those MFA requirements met. So the expectation here is you've got MFA already met. So now if you need to lock a user out after 10 attempts, it can be locked out. I still advocate leave it at 6. There's no reason if you previously had it at 6 to move this to 10. But MFA is a must. Minimum password length has increased. Previously, it was 7. Now it's 12. Password history of 4 passwords must be maintained now. Password must be changed every 90 days if not using MFA. Again, but there's going to be some cases where MFA just can't be done. But again, to really be PCI 4.0 compliant, you've got to do MFA at the remote access level and at the CDE. No hard-coded passwords for accounts that can be used for interactive logins. I know I've seen this in so many environments, and recently of all the breaches, especially Uber, is you'll have a service account, you'll put that in a flat file or a configuration file or some other file that service can access to be able to do what it needs to do. Requirement 8.6.2 says no more hard-coded passwords for service accounts that can be used in an interactive basis. So take a look at that. Again, this is where that whole year is going to come into play to make sure that you've got the ramp to evaluate everything that you're doing here to meet this requirement. Requirement 10.4.1 requires the use of an automated mechanism now for audit log reviews. The technology is out there. Humans just can't keep up with the amount of volume, velocity, and variety of data that's out there that we need to review. You got to use the tools to do automated reviews of logs. Okay, so again, we hit the highlights. There's a more comprehensive approach to this, which we'll talk about at the end, but we're going to talk about how you would address some of these on NonStop now. So XYPRO and HPE have a suite of products out there called Zygate Security 1. Zygate Security 1 gives you all of the tools, all of the controls, and all of the monitoring necessary to become compliant with PCI 4.0. Its real objective is real-time threat detection and ransomware protection for NonStop. So Security 1 itself is a dashboard, which is what you interact with, but it also includes all of the controls and tools necessary to harden your system to comply with those requirements. Security 1 includes features such as integrity monitoring, which we're going to talk about, compliance reporting, and risk management. We're doing all of this using patented technology to correlate and contextualize data to give you actionable results in a highly visual interactive dashboard so you know exactly what's going on your system, in your operating, for your operating system, your users, what they're doing, your appliances, your CLEMs, and your NonStop consoles. Everything is visually represented in real time in a dashboard. The real key here is to reduce the cost of security incidents. So if we can prevent, and that's what compliance does, it's really putting all of the controls in place to prevent something from happening in the future. And knowing that what you've got in place is going to actively monitor and alert you when something goes wrong. That's what Security One does. It's 2023. Context is key. We've always said data is king, but data is just data unless you know what to do with it. Otherwise, it sits in buckets, it sits in cloud repositories, it's all over the place. And unless somebody knows what the data means and what to do with it, yeah, data is king, but data is useless. Context is really the key. So that's what we focus Security One on, is we want to consume as much data, all of the data from NonStop as possible. And then we start what we do best, is apply a layer of context to understand what that data means and how you need to act on it in your environment. Now, you'll hear a lot of vendors talk about correlation, and they'll talk about machine learning, etc. Correlation is not context. Correlation takes two pieces of data and finds commonality between them, links them together, and all that does is create more data from existing data that somebody needs to then understand and still apply context to what it means. Context will apply separation from noise. So it'll actually make your data useful. You want to consume all of your data, but you want to understand what it means to know if there's something that you need to pay attention to or act on, or if it's benign. That's also an important activity, because a lot of time we spend a lot of time going down rabbit holes, investigating things that might mean anything in our environment. So we need to make sure that we're throwing away the stuff that's benign and we can ignore safely, and focusing on the data that's actually actionable. Reducing false positives is a very positive effect of this. Okay, I mentioned file integrity monitoring earlier, but to be compliant with PCI 4.0 and even the previous PCI requirements, file integrity monitoring is a cybersecurity fundamental and a must. This is really the only way to be able to detect ransomware, malware, and viruses on NonStop. So file integrity monitoring at its core will alert you when anything changes on your system. Now think about it. To introduce a virus or malware or ransomware on NonStop, somebody's got to physically introduce an object into the environment. If you have real-time file integrity monitoring in place, the moment that object is introduced into your environment, you're getting an alert. You're getting an alert telling you that somebody introduced something in your environment. And because of these reasons, we suspect that this is something malicious you need to pay attention to. This becomes key if you have a ransomware attack starting on your system and you start seeing files change. You want to know about that immediately. Now, it's no good if you're doing a periodic, weekly or monthly scan. The damage has been done. Forget about it. You might, if you can't recover from that, you might as well be out of business. So real-time file integrity monitoring is key against ransomware detection for NonStop. Plus, it's going to help you become PCI 4 compliant. Now, there's all kinds of side benefits as well. It can identify human error. If somebody did something to a file that they weren't supposed to, you're going to see that change. You're going to see what changed. You're going to see the previous value, the new value, and you're going to know that somebody was doing something they weren't supposed to. PCI or file integrity monitoring is recommended by HPE's NonStop hardening guide, and it's necessary for compliance with PCI, GDPR, SOX, GLBA, FISMA, you name the regulation or framework, and it's going to be a requirement. It's also a cybersecurity fundamental. Just like I talked about MFA earlier, that it's a must in every environment, file integrity monitoring in combination with MFA will give you the best cybersecurity bang for your buck. Forget about all those other tools. Those can come later. As long as you have file integrity monitoring and MFA in your environment, you're off to a great start and you're getting maximum value for your security investment. Now, when it comes to PCI 4, File integrity monitoring is mentioned in several requirements. Requirement 10.3.4, 11.5.2, 12.10.5, and it just goes on and on and on. So to be compliant with PCI 4, FIM is an absolute requirement. You can't get around it. Now, Security One has real-time file integrity monitoring capabilities. Now, this supports both Guardian and OSS. We're looking at both sides. We're doing file fingerprinting. We've got all kinds of features where you can create blacklists, whitelists, allow lists to know that this is normal activity. You expect these files in this location to change or be transient, or these are, for example, application configuration files or operating system files that should never be touched. And the moment they're touched, you want to know about it. You will get visibility into all of that in real time with Security One integrity monitoring. Security One will also help you with incident response. So this will give you real-time alerting based on incident patterns that are occurring in your environment to know if somebody is doing something that they shouldn't be doing, or if they're trending towards something malicious. So if we see something out of the ordinary because we've profiled your system and know what's normal, so we can identify when somebody goes out of that normal circle and starts doing things they're not supposed to be doing. This can be a system administrator or database administrator start poking around into areas of the system that we've never seen them access before. That's a concern. Why are they in a location that they've never accessed in the past? You want to know about that, and you want to know about that in real time. Another benefit of Security One is all of this data can be integrated with context into your SIM or your SOAR. So if you've got QRadar, if you've got Splunk, if you've got other orchestration tools, Security One data can be fed in an intelligent format into those SIMs. So now they know exactly what's happening on the nonstop. It's a challenge to forward just raw nonstop data. If you've been responsible or seen that raw data, it can be very hard to understand. And especially when you have no understanding of nonstop, it's going to be difficult to know what a pathway is, or what SafeCom is, or what other commands or other activity are happening that show up in raw data logs. Now, Security One will consume all of that raw data. It'll take, let's say, 10 raw nonstop events, correlate them, and contextualize them into a single incident. So what we'll say is these 10 events mean this single incident, and then we'll take that single incident and forward it to Splunk or to QRadar. Now QRadar knows exactly what activity is happening on the nonstop to know if they need to raise an alert. So in summary, Security One is going to help you with everything you need to become PCI 4.0 compliant on nonstop. It's going to give you all of the controls, all of the tools, all of the hardening, and the real-time monitoring to be able to become 4.0 compliant. And it's going to do it in an automated way. You're going to be able to relieve a lot of the stress and the manual effort that your team's doing right now by just putting Security One in place and letting the technology and the engine do what it does best. Okay, going back to multi-factor authentication, I do want to highlight a new library product that we've got available through HPE now, and it's multi-factor authentication for nonstop applications. Now, most of you are familiar with Zygate user authentication, and that's going to provide MFA for your interactive logons to nonstop, so your Guardian logons or your user logons. But if your users are not logging onto the operating system, if they're logging straight into an application like Base24 using the Base24 pathway, multi-factor authentication should still be a requirement. So we've added a library now that can attach to Base24 or any any nonstop application, and it'll give you multi-factor authentication capabilities for your application. So this can be embedded in any mission-critical application on nonstop. So what this will do is you'll still have your normal login screen to your application, but before you're authenticated and can use the application, you'll be presented with a second screen that looks like the one that you're seeing right now that'll ask you for your MFA credentials. This can be a token. This can be integrated with RSA or Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator or whatever MFA provider you have. But before you can access the application, you've got to pass a second layer of protection before you can use the application. This is a library, like I said, that attaches to your application. It requires a little bit of modification to your login scripts, but once it's done, it works seamlessly. And we've got this implemented all over the world for anybody that needs MFA for base 24. So a couple of screenshots showing the base 24 login, put in your username and password, and then it'll dump you into the second screen where you would put in your MFA credentials. Okay, just to sum it all up, XYPRO compliance reporting, how that can save you thousands of hours. I've seen a lot of customer environments where compliance activity and evidence generation is a very manual process. It can take weeks to months to gather everything needed for an audit. And then as soon as that's done, the next one starts right after that. So having the technology and the automation in place is going to reduce a lot of the manual effort, reduce the potential for error, and give you real-time visibility into all of these compliance frameworks. And with all that, you're going to be able to increase staff productivity. You know, you can take a very manual, very tedious process away from them, let the engine do it, let the technology do it. Now your staff can focus on things that you need them to focus on, which is responding to potential threats, investigating actionable data that you're getting presented from Security One, automating incident response. So they're not the ones having to churn through logs and Excel files and other sources of data. They're actually acting on the results of the data rather than generating the data and the analysis for it. It's a customer case study from Discover Financial Services that implemented Security One for their compliance and auditing process. And it's a very, I mention this every opportunity I get, but I've never heard this before, but Tanya Jones, who's their senior manager of cybersecurity, said PCI audit time went from 1 week to 30 minutes using Security One. And she's in fact looking forward to her next PCI audit because of all the automation that Security One introduced. And now her team is able to focus on the work that she needs to focus on rather than going through logs and generating evidence. Okay, we're almost at the end, I promise. Thank you for sticking with this. Again, like I said, we only hit the tip of the iceberg, and I love talking about this stuff. If you want to reach out afterwards and expand on any one of these topics, happy to do it. But as far as more resources go, if you visit XYPRO.com, on the front page, you're going to see a summary of changes for HPE NonStop. We've written a document. It's about a 60-page document that covers all of the changes between PCI DSS version 3.2.1 and 4.0, but it's focused on applicability to NonStop. So it's a very NonStop specific document of what the changes are between the last requirement or the last standard and the new standard, and how you would meet those on NonStop. So it's very prescriptive on, you know, do this, implement this, use this technology to address those requirements. Also follow our website. We're posting a ton of content on PCI 4.0 and we're constantly talking about it. So there's always new things coming up. And with the whole year now in front of us to be able to get ready for it, there's going to be tons more information that we're going to be sharing. We also offer PCI DSS assessment services. So remember, one of the things that you should be doing this year is a gap assessment to understand where you currently are and how you need to get to PCI 4.0. We can help you with that. We've got the tools and the expertise to assist with an assessment. Okay, last slide, I promise. Thank you for sticking with me. We're almost done. So XYPRO does offer a free security assessment as well. So this is completely free, nothing to install on your system, no cost to the customer. We're evaluating 120 different security vectors in 6 key categories, and we're giving you an actionable report that you can then do something with. So it's not marketing fluff. We're not trying to say buy this product to address these things. We're actually telling you these are the areas where you need to shore up, and these are the things that you should be doing to address these concerns that we found. Again, nothing to install. It's a single object file that you introduce, that you upload to your system, run it. It gives you an output. Send us that output and we'll generate a report for you within 24 to 48 hours. Again, completely free. If you want to find out more about it, reach out to HPE or reach out to XYPRO and we'll get you started. With that, I appreciate everybody's time today. Thank you. I know some of you are very early in your morning. Some of you are very late at night. I hope you found this helpful. I do see a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to pick those up, and happy for you to reach out and expand on any one of these topics. So one of the questions I'm looking at is, if a customer uses Zygate Security 1 and or NSDA, could the new Linux security products be a benefit? For NonStop, no. So the new Linux security product is a product that we have called Wazzle, which we acquired from HPE. Its primary focus is security hardening and monitoring for SAP HANA environments, Red Hat Linux environments, and SUSE Linux environments. So as far as Justin, I'll have to follow up with you on this one to make sure that I'm properly understanding the question. But if they have Security 1's for NonStop, and then Wazzle is for everything but NonStop. Has XYPRO developed, or are you developing a project plan for customers to get to the 4.0 standard? Yes, we are. In fact, if you look at that document that I mentioned a couple of slides ago, you'll see exactly how we're getting there. So it's still in its early stages of what the plan looks like, because PCI 3.2.1 is still active. So those assessments can continue taking place until March 2024. But in the meantime, just like I advocated for customers to use that time, not sleep on it, and use that time to get ready for PCI 4.0, XYPRO is doing the same thing. So we've got our game plan as well. So when customers need to migrate from 3.21 to 4.0, we're ready with everything. And the first step is that document. The second step is let us help you do a gap assessment to understand what are the things that we need to put in place so we're not boiling the ocean. Okay, I've got a couple of other questions here. Sorry, I've got to stop sharing so I can see them. Okay, are there any changes for data encryption? So yes, there are changes, like I mentioned in requirement 3, where there's been a lot of emphasis on data encryption and how to secure PAN data and authentication data. So PCI 4.0 allows for disk level encryption of removable media. This is, I think, in requirement 3.5.1. And that disk level encryption, or even partition level encryption, can be used to render PAN unreadable on removable devices, whereas previously there was no requirement for removable devices. Now using disk level encryption for data encryption of those types of data on removable devices is a must. But there are also a lot of enhancements to requirement 3. So read our document, go to our website, click on that PCI 4.0 document that outlines the changes, and you'll see exactly what are the ones applicable to NonStop. Okay. If an organization gets recertified on January 2024, and their following certification is done in January 2025, can they still be certified on 3.2.1 because the cutoff is in March 2025? It's an interesting one. PCI, so let me think about that one. PCI 3.2.1 will be retired in March 2024. So anything after March 2024 will require PCI 4.0. So in January 2024, you can certify on 3.2.1, but that next certification in January 2025 must be on PCI 4.0. Okay, Is there any plans to integrate the Linux security product with SecurityOne to provide a tool for virtualized NonStop environment? It's an option, John, absolutely. So yes, we do realize that there are essentially two products that do very similar things, be it on separate platforms. But yes, there is discussion around that. I can't go too much into roadmap, but that is an option that can be explored. Okay, how are financial institutions handling PAN protection when PAN is the primary key on a database distributed by card number? Oof, that's a good question. I can't speak to organizations or financial institutions' practices of how they do that, but my position has always been never, never, never use a PAN or other sensitive data like that as the primary key. Because if you let's say if you tokenize that, which is an option, you can tokenize that data, but just imagine the amount of IO every time you're trying to access that data. So like I said, I can't speak to why that's done that way, but from a security best practices standpoint, I would say never use your sensitive data or that type of data as your primary key for a database. Okay, with that, appreciate everybody's time. Thank you for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening. This presentation will be posted on our website as well as on YouTube. And that document's already ready on the website that shows the comparison between 3.2.1 and 4.0. Also, take advantage of our rapid security assessment. Reach out to us, reach out to HPE, and we'll get you started with that. And with that, thank you, everybody, and talk to you soon.